Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our book launch this evening. Sorry for our slight delay. Technical hiccups do happen when you do so many Zoom launches. Thanks for your patience. I'm really glad you're here. Thanks for joining us to launch Tristram, Fane, Saunders debut collection. Before we go any further, I'm really excited he's here now. He's going to read for us. We're also joined by Luke Kennard, who is going to be on screen in a couple of moments, and they will be talking to each other soon as well. I'm just going to run over some housekeeping so that we all know where we are, what's going on, and what to expect. So, for the next hour, please do find the chat box, say hello to us. We like to know where you're watching from. I'm popping a code for you to buy a copy of the book in the chat for you now. Thank you for paying your £2 to be here. We really appreciate that. And you can redeem that against a copy of the book, against multiple copies of the book for all your friends and family. While Tristram is reading for us, I am going to put the poems up on screen for you so you can read along as well. You're in control of your own screen, so if you need to reconfigure it, have a play around, and you should be able to change it to suit any needs you have. I'm here and will do my best to answer any technical questions if you have them, put them in the chat. Now, later on in the event, there'll be time for some audience questions as well. So as well as finding the chat, which I can see you're doing, thank you, please find a separate button. It says Q&A on it. And if you've got any questions for Tristram, drop them in there and then Luke will be able to read them to him later on in the event. So I think that is really everything for now that's sort of probably not even that important. The important stuff is that we're joined by Luke Kennard, who is Professor of Creative Writing at Birmingham, and his books include novels, including from 2017, The Transition, and more recently in 2022, The Answer to Everything, which both came out with Fourth Estate. And his poetry collections he's known for include Cain, which came out in 2017, and Notes on the Sonnets, which came out in 2021 and won the Forward Prize, both of which came out from Penned in the Margin. So if you don't know Luke's work, check that out as well. But for now, I'm very pleased to ask him on screen to join me to begin our event. Thanks, Luke.
Hey, thank you, Jasmine. Hi, it's nice to not see you all, but it's nice to be with you. I'm Luke Kennard, poet and bon vivant. It's a pleasure to be introducing Tristram Fane Saunders, who most of you I think will probably know is a very fine critic and journalist, as well as the author of 5 pamphlets, including Woodsong, which I thoroughly enjoyed so much that I blurbed it a few years back. And also he's the editor of Edna St. Vincent Millay's collected. This is his debut collection of poems. And it's a book that made me happy in several significant ways, which made me think about what I look for when I pick up a new collection, what it is that I'm waiting to hear that will keep me invested in the whole text. And it's usually a similar sort of thing. It's some sense of intensity of imagination and wit, naturally, and there's plenty in Before We Go Any Further. Or even Frank O'Hara's Signs That People Do Not Utterly Regret Life, which is also in abundance. And also, perhaps, I don't know, maybe this is specific to me and my general mean-spiritedness, but I look for imagery that makes me enraged with jealousy, of which there is one on at least every page of Tristram's debut collection. But I think also, centrally for me, this kind of sense of something being at stake for the poet, that in some sense they're writing because they wouldn't be able to get through the world otherwise, or wouldn't even have a world to be in. So almost this sense of urgency, not so much being cornered by the ancient mariner at a wedding, as rather being able to escape from the lime tree bower, your leg magically healed, and take the walk and have the intimate conversations that the poet is so desperate to be having. The sort of double-edged Coleridge reference, because I think there is a sort of Coleridge influence in these poems, which I'll talk to Tristram about later, even if he doesn't want to. And every phrase in this book, which I've been just enjoying reading and rereading over the last few weeks, is worth pausing over and has been sweated over. Even the title, Before We Go Any Further, has that sense of urgency that I mentioned, also connotations of pausing on the cusp of something, just this last minute check, or a sense of being right at the point of no return and needing to get a few things across before it's too late, or saying, all things considered, are you sure about this? And there's this radical uncertainty sometimes to the voice in these poems, which I just adored throughout. At times, Saunders has this intensity of invention in the way that kind of Nabokov does in Pale Fire. There are some delightful puncturings of the fourth wall and these poems within poems, fake poets within poems, and kind of ideas within ideas, as well as this relish for riddles and wordplay, which are kind of woven into the craft. But critically, this is something that facilitates an emotional intelligence in the poems, and also a really quite startling facility for nature imagery, which, as I mentioned, makes me insanely jealous. There's a poem where the sun is post-it yellow, which has been in my head ever since. And in the poem Silkworms, there's this kind of scriptural weight to the analogy, balanced with its theatricality. I'll just quote a few. I'm making sure I'm quoting lines from poems that Tristram isn't reading. Those miracle white angel wings are props. They must pick up the beds they are and walk. There is also an amazing description of a bee, which I won't spoil because it is in the set, which we'll move on to very shortly. I won't go on for much longer than another paragraph. And this would be enough in itself, right? All of these effects and this kind of individual, new, fresh feeling voice. But we're never left floating, detached over the scene, marveling at the descriptions of the natural world. We're part of this complex and painful human negotiation and the relationships that take place within it. And in the book, intimacy becomes this act of the imagination as much as any other. In one poem, the speaker quite literally tells stories in order to save their partner from their darkest thoughts. And there's this sense that all of the speakers in the poems and all of us are kind of versions of Scheherazade, making sense of the world or delaying the inevitable and using everything we have in our arsenal to do so. And what emerges overall is this profound sense of poetry as the art of connection and of noticing what to connect and being attentive to that, to the world as it comes to us, to the worlds that we make for each other. In one of the Crystal Palace Park poems in the center of the collection, there's a line, like bowerbirds, we gather things that mean together. That's it from me. Thank you for listening, and please join me silently but rapturously in welcoming Tristram Fane Saunders.
Well, thank you, Luke, for yeah, that was just an amazing introduction. I feel the only way for things to go from here is down. I'm not entirely sure that the reading can live up to that, but I'll do my level best. I think the only place to start is with the title poem. Before we go any further, let's tether our hot, sore hearts to the post. Tie up our lungs, leave our breath to catch itself. Lighter and calmer, we'll walk up to the crest of this hill and stop. Place your place your hands to my empty chest. Knock twice for luck, as I raise mine up under your hair. Stroke the nape of the neck that crooks to one side as you listen, until we hear nothing beat slower. Then, and only then, will we turn back, hand in hand, to unhook the soft bronchi that buck, still hoarse from shouting, scoop our hearts cool from the trough, pick up right where we left off. Thanks. So this is a book that's in 3 sections, and the first section is filled with kind of what I think of as being nocturnes. They're kind of nighttime poems about insomnia and sort of dark thoughts and moments of being in the place between 2 places. I hate the word liminal as a journalist. I spend a lot of my life editing it out of articles, but I guess there's some poems about the kind of the place between being awake and being asleep. And the first poem of that section is called The Somnambulist, which is set at a costume party, which I always think are places that it's a bit like walking into a book halfway through and being bombarded by different poems. This one is, yeah, so the next poem I'd like to read for you is called The Somnambulist. And the character we meet in it is dressed as that character from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the brilliant silent film. But the speaker of the poem at the time they meet knows nothing about that, and is, as you frequently do at a party, bluffing and pretending to have seen a movie in order to impress someone you like. The Somnambulist. Caligari. Even if I'd seen the film, no one there had, except for you, handsome but shy, and the Hulk explaining Prynne in the kitchen doorway to a cornered Harley Quinn. Your darkened sockets felt tipped into diamond points, haunted look and turtleneck would always add up to nobody's first guess. Edward Scissorhands without the scissors? Unless I'd lied and yelled, great costume, yes, I'd recognize you anywhere. We never would have met. We slept together once, or almost slept. All night I watched your broken, unplugged TV set paint shadows longer than the walls. At dawn you cracked the blind. Your eyes and clanging headache had you running straight to the bathroom cabinet. Charivari comes from Charabaria, Greek for migraine, heavy head. It's a parade of noise and hate, rough music, metal banging metal, a chorus raised to shame a real or imaginary figure of disgrace. When the angry townsfolk chase the dark-eyed man, he runs until his heart gives out. The final reel reveals it's all a dream. The face belongs to someone else. I still don't know his name. Now, the next poem I'd like to read you is from the same section, and it's a poem that I feel that the title of it, for the last couple of years, suddenly was freighted with a different kind of weight to what it had before. It's called Health, and I wrote this at the very end of 2019, while actually staying in a kind of log cabin inside the Botanic Gardens in Ventnor on the south coast of the Isle of Wight. It's one of the few poems in the book that I think of as kind of anti-writer in residence poems. I love writing about places and while I'm hunkered down in places. And I sometimes get poems out of it, but I don't think I've ever once had a poem come out of a visit to a place that anyone involved with running that place would be happy to have exist. There's one in here too that I won't be reading tonight, about the Seamus Heaney Home Place Museum in Northern Ireland, which I think will guarantee they would never ask me to go back and would probably bar me from returning. But this is me ruling myself out as a return visitor to the Botanic Gardens in Ventnor. Health. What is that? Something honey-like that makes me lean in closer. A tag in Latin dangling from its neck below the bloom. Every flower has a stamen. Do I mean a stigma at its heart, to lure the needle-bearing honeybee, doing its rounds from bed to bed, fretting like a doctor, looping its indecipherable cursive in the air. The poster campaign tells us we must work to fight the stigma over mental health. But they don't mean that. Health, I mean. Nobody is angry or ashamed of being healthy. The rich sea air, my guidebook says, and rising temperatures mean semi-hardy plants that elsewhere just can't hack the weather, survive the whole year round outside here, kept alive by Ventnor. All my friends are sick. I love them and I'm scared. Zed is sick. I mean, she's ill. An ill wind, boding ill. The body bodes the way a broken bone can sense the storm, her every joint an advert for the coming inner weather. I want to help, but all I do is rhyme. seeking shelter from the rain that all at once is everywhere and on me. I turn a corner past the greenhouse, find the blue pagoda. In it, you are reading this. Hello. Can I sit down? This is the closest I will ever come to being honest. Look at the pretty flowers. People died where we are sitting. Everyone my age is sick. I've never slept beside someone who didn't need pills to separate the day from night. Some of them have disappeared. Some wear the stigmata on the lower inner arm that marks the almost martyr. Variegated, reads the metal tag. Perennial. The sky is bleeding white, squeezed dry above the blue pagoda, but the rain keeps coming. That was the other thing. It's why they made the garden here, after they knocked the old place down. In a room beside the mushroom house, a TV set repeats 3 minutes of a video from 1969. The BBC had sent a helicopter like a humming bee to hover near the empty sanatorium, not yet collapsed. A tracking shot. There's just so much of it, window after window, and an unseen voice explaining how the lungs would fill with what was held in drops of water. I'd like to bring them here, my friends. Tell them everything they lie in bed and think of doesn't matter for a while, that it can wait until they've got their breath back in this shelter we have made from words. The guidebook mentions that the doctor who founded Ventnor's Institute for Sickness of the Chest died here. Tuberculosis, yes, despite the warm sea air and honey in hot water. Is it me or is it getting darker? Now it's late and I can hardly see the flowers. Close your eyes and sit with me for just a little longer. We'll talk about our friends, about the flower and its stigma till this rain dies down. The guidebook says he tried, the doctor. The guidebook says it's quiet here, but we can't hear it over the water falling everywhere and on the blue pagoda. Now, and here's where I anxiously glance at the set list. I think the next poem I'm going to read from you is actually something a little bit lighter. So Luke mentioned there's a sequence of poems in the book all about Crystal Palace Park, and I live right near the park in Penge in South London, and I spent a lot of the years around sort of 2020, 21 wandering around the park, which is filled, if you haven't been, absolutely you should go. It's filled with these bizarre things that even locals sometimes forget are there or don't realize that they're there. There's London's largest hedge maze in the center of the park, but it's almost impossible to find. Finding the maze is harder than finding your way through it. There are these models of dinosaurs, which are probably the best known feature, but also right up near the top of the park from the time that the Crystal Palace was made in 1854. They installed these replica sphinxes because Egypt, so there was a kind of Victorian Egyptomania going on at the time, and the palace itself was destroyed by fire, but the sphinxes are still there, and so this is a poem about one of them, the Sphinx. It's lunch, and I've one leg on either side of the brick red haunch, a straddle or astride, a flask on his flank, a sandwich where the spine would lie if either of us liars had one, hind legs before me and the fore behind. Although it's true we don't see eye to eye, uneager for the future, I'll keep mine fixed on what for him's already gone. We've this in common. Neither will admit we are going nowhere. Someone taught him sit in 1854. He mastered it. The hand that framed this fearful symmetry made something less the bane of Thebes than kith to Clifford, big red dog. The hieroglyphs say nothing. Lorem ipsum dollars sit in Middle Kingdom script. The riddles why the hell we're here, red-faced. Him, Blame the eye of Mr. Jones, first pharaoh of primary colours when London's walls and tastes and skies were grey. Me? I've been struggling to cope. The thermos spirals open with a sigh. Pandora's dog-red lunchbox will be empty, the lone and level sandwich gone. Still, why not give the box a shake? It sounds like hope. And so something we haven't spoken about yet, or I haven't spoken about yet, is playing games with language and I guess what people think of as capital F form in the poems. And I like, for me, I enjoy poetry that feels in some way as much music as narrative or imagery. And so I like to find a sound and riff on it, like with the letter I running as the kind of spine down the back of this poem, almost all the lines chiming with that, or having having all of the lines in Health a moment ago being on the same sort of regular 7 beats, which is a length I think that's long enough that people don't necessarily notice that that's the pattern that's happening. It can sound conversational, but to the ear, there's still that kind of music underpinning it. It doesn't look obvious on the page, but it kind of matters to me that it's there. And the next poem I'd like to read, I think, is from a section of the book that's quite interested in wordplay and games. There's a moment where it's where the conceit, the kind of idea is that the book is interrupted by a different book entirely, that someone has broken into Carcanet's printers late at night and bribed an insomniac printer to insert this pamphlet of cursed medieval folk songs collected by an academic at an unnamed university who's died under mysterious circumstances, but spent his last months translating these medieval folk songs into modern English. And there's a Welsh elegy, there's an Irish drinking jig, but the one I'm going to read for you is called Witch Brook, and it's an old Scots folk song. It's a sort of murder ballad, I think, or I like to think of it as one. I'll try that again. My smooth brook knows no storm-blown sky, no flood to drown, nor drouth to dry, no owl to hoot, nor flock to throng. On old Witch Brook look not too long. No goby swoops, try not thy hook, worms only rot on old Witch Brook. From Witch Brook's slop grow rocks of gold, my worldly goods, soon got, soon sold. Row north, my son, by soft moon glow, to cold Witch Brook, by frost, by snow. Go soon, my son, by strong wood prow. Don't stop, nor stoop to mop my brow. To goes to know Witch Brook's own cost. Blood, my son, my fool, my loss. Now, I wrote the sequence of poems this comes from largely out of spite. There's a form of poem that I've always disliked, or I've kind of, that's impressed me but irritated me, which are what people call univocalisms, poems that only use one vowel. I feel so much of the time it's like seeing a beautiful tiny scale model of Walthamstow bus stop made out of matchsticks, and you look at it and think, God, it's a model of Walthamstow bus stop made out of matchsticks. The whole thing is made out of matchsticks. It must have taken ages. It's impressive that you've just used this one tool to do that. And the kind of trick is the thing that's good about it. And I wanted to see if I could make some univocalisms, some one vowel poems that's not so noticeable, or that's not the only thing to enjoy. I kind of wanted them to be an exact one-to-one replica of the bus stop and have people getting on and off the buses and waiting for their watch and feeling really annoyed about being in this quite flimsy bus stop and not notice that it's made entirely out of matchsticks. I was quite pleased. I won't tell you where, but I sent off a couple of these to a magazine a while ago who were quite nice about them, but didn't notice that the whole thing was a joke and that each poem only had one vowel, and quite earnestly asked, was I really certain that Witchbrook was from volume O of Lost Folk Songs of Troon? Shouldn't it be volume 1? I had to explain it couldn't be volume 1 because I'm not allowed digits and I'm not allowed the letter E from the word one. And they were they took it in good spirits, which was nice, rather than storming off angrily. But it was quite fun to write, although it was one of those things that became a bit all encompassing. The U poem, the poem in the key of U, was a bit difficult. I remember vividly waking up at 4 a.m. saying, "There's another word that has just the letter U in," and dashing to the nearest notepad. I think I only have one poem left for you, at least in the planned set list, which is something a little bit sillier. In terms of things written out of spite and things that irritate me, quite frequently I read a lot of poetry, and a thing that always bothers me is when you see the title of a poem and then immediately under it, after, and then a name. Just because it can be so various in its meanings. It could mean this is a direct English translation of a particular poem by that person. Or it could mean this person is an artist and this poem is directly inspired by a particular work of art by them. Or it could mean I've stolen the first 3 lines of this poem from that person and I wanted to kind of nod towards that theft. Or it could mean I had a dream about this person and wrote something entirely different, and people use it in different ways. And it seems a kind of catch-all. So the next poem is called Under, and it's after Jonas Hanway, who was not a poet or a writer, but apparently is the first Englishman in recorded history to have used an umbrella to keep the rain off. And so, only insofar as that is true, this is a poem after him. Under. My love, come on in out of the outdoors, into a room whose walls are beaded curtains, whose roof relies on one supporting beam, whose swift collapse is all but guaranteed. We'll let whoever's taller take in hand the rain-black, wordless question of its curved cedilla handle. Listen to its Morse. O kettle drum for drunk percussionists. O wandering gazebo, wayward tent. Look up, my love. We'll scry its nylon star map. The constellations spoke and spoke and spoke, bespeak a world of worse alternatives. Yonder, the walking damp. And those who turn to unarticulated surrogates, unfashionable hats, etc. Behold the phantom of a headless man, his collar yanked up over his wet hair, sleeves flapping like an unloved spaniel's ears. But pity more, the wretched few caught short with only, say, a newspaper for shelter, or worst of all, a single sheet of paper. What good's a page against the whole damn world? But if you're ever under, really under, nothing between you and the falling sky, beloved, take this poem, hold it up like you hold me, that it may lead you, however far it's able, homeward, dry. Thank you.
Tristram, thank you. That was marvelous. Thanks so much for reading. We're going to have a sort of brief chat stroke interview, and we can kind of segue naturally into the Q&A. So if you have any questions, could you please write them into the Q&A section just at the bottom of the screen, and I will filter them and relay them to Tristram. But I have a bunch of questions too. My first one, actually, I was going to ask about the liminal, and but I'm going to cancel that. Something I wanted to, I was going to start with a really kind of softball, non-academic-y kind of question, like when did you start writing poetry? What kind of got you into writing it? But I think we'll sort of circle back to that, because I really, as you were just giving us this sort of insight into the process and into some of the motivations behind the poems, I really liked the idea of kind of writing in response to or in reaction to something that really irritates you, like particularly within the medium that you practice in, right? And it's like, it's the kind of thing that Lacan would probably call jouissance, this sort of negative kind of passion. And I really wanted to ask about that, like that kind of method. I think it is extremely generative. Like, is that, and it's something that for me goes way beyond kind of pastiche or satire. It's something where it's almost like this artistic kind of corrective, where it's like, it annoys me when something's done this way, and can I get something out of this idea? This is not leading to a question mark at all, I've just realized. But is that kind of a method that you use in some ways, that kind of reaction to what's happening in contemporary poetry, and a way of sort of carving out your own space in it, if that makes sense?
I think it's much less rational and thought through than that. I mean, with the univocalisms thing, it was just I read a fair few of them and heard them performed, and something about it irritated me, and I couldn't quite figure out what it was. But I think anything that generates a reaction in you is a good thing and an interesting thing. And I mean, that stuck with me far more than, you know, I've heard poems that just don't leave any real impression. And so I thought, what is it about this form that's so, I think it's just that it's so contrived as a form. And I thought, I'm going to take, but I also like making things needlessly difficult for myself. But my favorite way of doing it is doing it and then concealing that. I don't want, I feel that's my bag of neuroses, and I don't want to kind of inflict that on the reader. But if somehow making life really difficult for myself can generate a poem that feels like an enjoyable poem, and kind of hide the idea of putting all that in there and hiding it was the appeal for those particular poems. And the after thing, I mean, I'm hamming it up a bit. I was thinking about what it means. That was partly the, I can't remember if the after line for the guy who either invented the umbrella or was an early pioneer of the umbrella came first, or it's just the idea of the umbrella poem as a love poem kind of came first. But they seemed, I guess, I try and fill my poems with what I guess you might call Easter eggs, of things that are kind of jokes that you can spot and enjoy on a second or third reading. And it's really important to me that the poetry is kind of immediately enjoyable on a first reading. I don't want to write things that are needlessly difficult, but I do like writing things that are stuffed full of other things. And so I guess, and I don't think I really sort of write against contemporary poetry in any way, but I think I'm constantly reading poems that I love and trying to figure out what it is that I love about them. And that sense of plenty or excess stuffed into quite a small space is something I enjoy. So there are definitely some poems in the book that are doing that. I hope that's kind of an answer to the question.
Yeah, much worthier than the question deserved. Thank you. Just the but I feel like there's a similarity there within with the role that surrealism plays in the work as well, right? Because I think, because we can say, like, when something, so in the way that the univocalisms could have felt contrived if they weren't buried underneath sort of what's going on in them that actually distracts you as a reader. And I only noticed on my second read through that was happening in there. But like with the, because I think, like, for me, like, your work is more, it's more sort of hyper real than surreal. It takes small details, natural details, behaviors, and kind of intensifies them. And that's, I don't know, because I always find when I go back to like the original surrealists of movements, who's Breton and Perret and all that, it's kind of, it's like almost unbearably smug, like often the tone of the work, and kind of sort of vindictively meaningless to sort of shake us out of our bourgeois malaise in a way that I don't know if it worked at the time, and it doesn't work now. But there's sort of like, so there's kind of almost like trying to take something from the surreal. I mean, like, this can be a way of sort of transfiguring the everyday, but using it quite carefully, using it like a kind of quite a strong seasoning. But there is, like I said in the intro, there's this kind of emotional core to the work as well. Like there's this, like, there's always this kind of slightly rebellious streak in these poems, I feel like, and what you said about the, almost the kind of writing the writer in residence poems that the residency would not want to be written about them. Like, I love that. I think that's such a great sort of impetus to create this sort of work. And there is this kind of pushing back against these kind of conventions. There was a really nice quote in the chat that John Bende posted. Form is a way of fighting content. I got a Algren, which is really good. There's this pushback against these kind of conventions, but there's also this kind of it's not sentiment, but there's a kind of compassion to so many of these poems as well, and a kind of at times a really almost painful level of intimacy, of kind of care, of kind of love, which Fiona Sampson picks up on in her endorsement on the back, that there's this, many of these poems seek a remedy for their suffering beloveds, only to be openly frustrated by their own limitations. It's like, so it's I don't know, it's always weird asking a poet if they've done something deliberately, but is that something that you sort of, there's that sort of engagement with form, with strict form, that you haven't really thought through, and that engagement with the poetry of ideas and of the imagination, and the poetry of a kind of satire as well. But like, do you sort of deliberately add that kind of tension of this kind of a kind of love poetry, of a kind of poetry of devotion as well? Is that something really, do you just do that naturally, or is that kind of something? I'm going to stop asking questions and go to the Q&A, but
God, I mean, this is kind of fascinating, but I'm trying to, I feel there's several bits. So there's surrealism and form and satire and love and real emotion. And do I chuck these all into a blender kind of by accident? And the answer is maybe yes. But I think it's kind of natural to write about feelings in a way. What we're saying about kind of intimacy, I guess. I can be quite an emotionally reserved person, but I also think that the poems that I love and I think of as being true poems are ones that communicate a kind of real feeling. And it sort of doesn't matter what the feeling came from. It's that the feeling itself has to be true. And I feel that have surrealism and kind of formal patterning, or making patterns, or creating hoops to jump through can be ways of achieving that kind of truthfulness and rawness and intimacy, because it stops you from doing whatever your first instinct would be, and it stops you from just being the person you usually be in a conversation. You can't say the thing that's your first thought. You have to do something stranger than that, and you find yourself kind of prodded into actually. I think surrealism was all about accessing the subconscious and kind of deeper truths that might not be apparent to your waking mind. And there's something I believe in. I always found appealing as an idea. I feel that having some kind of rules or formal patterns in place can do the same thing for me, that the writing science becomes more unexpected and more honest and truthful. And I kind of get pushed by these things into saying things I might not otherwise say, or might not realize are true, but sort of realize later have a truth to them. I guess in terms of, I love surrealist artists, but there are two painters who I have specific poems inspired by in the book, who the thing I respond to in their work is the extremely heightened emotion of it, who are Eileen Agar, whose work I think just kind of radiates joy. And she has a lot of these things in almost got pastel colors in acrylic paint, and it's so bright and so joyful and so playful. And it's not the I admire someone like Magritte, but there's a kind of coldness to Magritte's painting. It's very much, I've taken a thing that does not belong in this place and put it into that place. But Eileen Agar's work is kind of just about having a million things that don't belong together colliding together in this kind of joyous explosion. Whereas the other one, Edith Remington, does these quite somber, quite haunting paintings with a lot of melancholy seaside resorts and skeletal figures. And that I feel that those are the two notes that I try and strike in a lot of these poems, of being, I guess, a bit sad and a bit spooky on the one hand, or being kind of overwhelmed with joy at how much stuff there is in the world on the other hand. And I think that's maybe true of me as a person, that I do kind of pivot between those two extremes a lot. So maybe that's kind of unavoidable that ends up in the poetry. I don't write very many poems, and I feel whenever I try and kind of justify why I've written these poems, I feel any answer I give you is kind of dishonest, because the true answer is just that's all I've got. I've got this, and I wish I was able to write more kinds of poem and more poems, and then be able to choose the ones that are doing a certain thing deliberately as being the ones for the book. But really, it's a bare larder.
Bare larder is good. Yeah, that's good. That really rings true. And that line in the last poem that you read, that you read, but if you're ever really stood out to me on first reading as one of those moments where just everything gets kind of punctured by this by this kind of empathy, really, which is really striking throughout the collection. I think it's a rare quality, I think, to sort of combine that level of at times kind of irony and at times the kind of intensity of invention with that level of soul, for want of a better word, as well, is really, yeah, it's really good. I might, sorry, please, no, please.
One thing I would say about that, of that particular line, and the idea of, I mean, it's a poem about the idea that this poem can be helpful in a moment of real emotional difficulty. And it's a lot of poets will be quite rude about anthologies that are like, 100 poems to mend a broken heart, or chicken soup for the soul, or the poetry acupuncture place. But I feel there is something kind of noble to the idea of a poem that can actually be useful. I feel intensely aware that almost everything I do is useless, and that includes most of these poems. So if the people that they're addressed to, or people who read them, find them in some way kind of emotion, I find myself feeling sort of emotionally healed is maybe a strong word, but reading a poem addressed to a particular person that shows that kind of love and intimacy, and the idea of the poem itself being a gift is something I find beautiful. And that's something I try and do occasionally when I don't think I'm necessarily very good at it, but it's something I'd love to be able to do well. One of my favorite poets is W.S. Graham, who I think I respond to partly because he's intensely interested in language and the idea of the poem as a made thing, and he's constantly reminding you that it's just a bunch of words on a sheet of paper, and that artifice is important to him. But there's also, at the same time, simultaneously, this incredible intimacy to it. And there's there's an amazing poem that he wrote for his wife Nessie that begins, "I leave this at your ear for when you wake." And I think that's just a lovely way of positioning a poem so quietly and so intimately. So maybe that's the thing that I kind of aim towards sometimes, but that's the sort of way up here, and I think I'm scrapping around somewhere quite far from that.
That's really good, thank you. I'm going to go to the Q&A. Please, anybody in the audience, to add any further questions to there. We could maybe finish on a final poem just before 8 when we end. But yeah, thanks for great answers, Tristram. First question is from John Glenday. You once described yourself as writing very few poems. How few is very few?
I've not finished a poem that I think of as being a sort of proper poem since I sent this book off in November. And in a good month, I might get a poem that month. There are some exceptions. I felt very conscious. I kept taking things out of this book until it reached the stage where John McAuliffe, my editor, had to point out that actually it wasn't going to be a book if there were just that few pages in it. And so I then took myself away to spend a week just sort of actually staying at my mum's house in York when she was away, with no phone and no internet, and just kind of forced myself to try and write as much as I could. I ended up getting 4 poems in this book out of that week. And so it does occur to me sometimes, if I just actually tried a bit harder and spent a bit more time trying to write rather than constantly saying what everyone always says is, oh, there's no time for writing. If I actually made some time, I might be able to write some more poems. But it's basically, I'd say I kind of average one a month. I don't know if that's many or not many, but it feels like not that many. I feel like I spend less time writing poetry than I spend doing just about anything else. I mean, I've cycled more times this year than I've written poems, but I've only cycled once in the last decade. And so it's hard to know how to frame those things, because I've done one trip on a bike and managed to not fall off, and then 0 poems. So there's still a gap there. Yeah, I mentioned this in the thing. There's a very nice review of the New Poetry's 8 anthology, which every few years Calcutta do these anthologies for new writers, and it meant an enormous deal to me that Michael Schmidt asked me to send in some poems to that. I mentioned in the introduction to that I don't write many poems, and there was a reviewer who was very nice about the poems, but said it was quite pretentious to say that I don't write many of them, and it hadn't even occurred to me that it could be taken that way. I felt it was more of a kind of shameful admission that I feel I'm not really a proper poet, and I have friends whose words seem to just kind of flow out of them, and that's never really been the case for me. I wish it was.
That's really good. I like the idea of the pressure in that moment in that week when you were in York I don't know if that's got something to do with the kind of the shape of a manuscript, like when you know you've got this body of work which you're drawing a line under, like this is the first collection, right? And what you do next will be part of the next thing, right? Will be part of this. So it's like, and you're aware of this, almost this, like before we go any further, we're aware of this kind of deadline like approaching, where it's like this, that maybe creates spaces. I don't know, maybe creates these spaces where it's like, actually the collection doesn't have anything about this in it yet, or it doesn't got it. But I also like really take the answer that you gave earlier, that it's like, it's so rare. I don't think I ever write anything deliberately. I don't think I ever set out to write a particular kind of poem, or a particular thing. I completely, the Bear Larder analogy really rings true for me. It's like that was all that was in there. It was some cream of tartar and a jar of cloves. So that's what you're bloody getting in this poem. But like, but there's something in that. There is this certain sort of spark where you can actually suddenly, the work does kind of pour out of you when there's this, you're approaching the edge of the cliff almost, not in a bad way, but
I mean, the poems that came out that week, there were a couple of them that felt very different to everything else I'd written, and I didn't really know what they were. I wasn't kind of sure that they were poems, so they didn't feel like my poems, and that was exciting. But there was one particular gap that I arrived knowing. I'd written all these poems about landmarks in the park, and I didn't have one about the dinosaurs, which is the first thing that anyone mentions when you mention that park. So I knew I had to get a dinosaur poem from somewhere, but I didn't know what it would be. And it ended up being a kind of wake up at 2 a.m. in the night for no reason, sit downstairs at the table and think, well, I'm awake now, and then suddenly it just kind of came to me. That kind of thing doesn't happen to me that often. What you were saying about drawing a line under it was really important to me, that some of the poems in this book are incredibly old. This is basically the poems of my 20s. So it is 10 years worth of stuff here. And I just turned 30 in April. And I actually, you mentioned you were going to ask about how I sort of got into writing poetry. I might just do like 30 seconds on that, because it was a kind of roundabout route. I was in a awful jazz punk band as a teenager, as the lead singer, and I use that word loosely. It was more kind of talking. I would play keyboards and talk, and we called ourselves jazz punk because we weren't cool enough to play punk, but we weren't talented enough to play jazz. So we did something between very badly. And when the band split up, I kind of kept doing just the words on my own as a performance poet. And I, for about 6 months, stumbled across a way of writing poems that people really enjoyed, which I have ever since then been unable to do. And I had a brief moment where I started doing a lot of gigs. I was sort of tour around the country a little bit and do places like Disc Cornhall and pubs in Camden. There was a brilliant performance art collective called Rants, run by a guy called Paul and a guy called Ian. And Paul used to be in a forgotten 80s new wave band who were massive in Denmark, and occasionally go over and play there. But the rest of the time, he'd do these brilliantly funny, kind of John Cooper Clarke style, angry, political, funny performance poems. I should mention they're both hardcore goths, so in all the leather and platform shoes. And he would do his political rants while playing the triangle, and then Ian would play the double bass, and that was kind of their act. And they'd have some poets and some comedians on, and so I used to go and read all my new poems there, and that would become my testing ground for new poems. And that, so I sort of started writing poetry for an audience. The idea of writing anything personally came to me much later. I'm still always aware of there being, you've got to keep people entertained somehow, that it is, it's a turn, it's a performance, and it has to be, I don't know, I've only just this year started keeping a diary of in verse as a thing entirely for me, just as a way of experimenting of, can I write poems that are just for me? But yeah, so I kind of got, that's how I got into poetry, was through the bad jazz punk band. We had a gig in York Municipal Cemetery once. That was fun. Yeah, so that was kind of the route into it.
That's beautiful. That's great. I really like these sort of unexpected crossovers with performance and with spoken word, and often and kind of how broad that space is as a kind of, I don't know. Yeah, I remember doing readings that I just really had no right to be doing as somebody who just never memorized his stuff, never put any effort at all into how it was actually performed. But it was kind of, there was this sort of open forum, but and it's also at the same time, it's quite a merciless space to test the work, even if it's a really kind audience,
I mean,
Because you feel, you realize when you read a line, it's like, I feel ashamed of myself for having just read that line out loud in front of anyone, even if they're being nice about it. And it is, I think it does sharpen, I don't know, some of that really carries over to the page, I think, just this sense of needing to show people a good time, whatever the subject matter and whatever the kind of, however strange or ambitious the impulse behind the poem is. It's like, yeah, that's really good. Thank you. It's getting on to 8, and there are 2 really lovely questions here which I want to fit in. One from Shehzad Doher. I was wondering on what basis you separated the book into the different sections, as you stated, and it would be lovely to hear more about that. And wonderful,
Sure.
Concur with.
So
the editing process.
3 sections. It's basically sad, weird, happy. And that's kind of how it goes. I mean, the sort of thematic overlap, there's a lot of stuff about water and nighttime scenes and kind of surrealist film and art in the first section. But it's basically sad poems about the failure to communicate with other people in some kind of interpersonal relationship. That's really what the first part of the book is about. And then the second part of the book segues into the impossibility of communicating anything, anywhere, in any way, regardless of other people. So there's poems that are kind of self-consciously about writing and about art, and things that are kind of surreal games and tricks and jokes and wordplay, and that all piles into the second part. And then the third section is kind of, aha, no, maybe it is possible to have a connection with people after all. As that's the poems about kind of love and friendship and family and all of the really soppy stuff that I really enjoy, and some of the more recent stuff in the book. And also I wanted that to feel the most grounded in reality. So there are lots of poems there that are in specific defined geographical places as a way of giving them a bit more kind of sense of truth, I think. Yeah, but fundamentally it's sad, then weird, then happy. That's kind of the arc.
That's really good. That feels really insightful, because that, I think, we have more control over. Like, I don't think any of us can help the poems that we write, the type of poems that we write, or what we happen to write on that particular day. It's the thing, the Little Women thing of, like, it's like fishing. You just catch what happened to be going through the river that day. But what we can control is how a manuscript, usually working with a good editor, a sensitive editor, but it's like that's what we can control, that kind of mood of what it's like taking in the whole collection and that journey through it. That feels kind of, yeah, that feels important. Last question, and then just have you got one last poem to end on after the?
Sure. Yeah, I could. I mean, do you have any requests, Lou?
Yeah, I will make a request. I've got a couple. I've got many. Most of them are asterisks, but I'll find one that I really like. I really like Curse. Is that too weird a poem to end on, or is that okay?
No, why not?
Great,
Actually, so weirdly, that poem got me the weirdest gig I've had in many years. There's a comedian called John Luke Roberts who read that poem and then asked me to come read some poetry at his night, Cabaret Impedimenta, in which I have to tell you really briefly about this. Different variety acts go up and they might do a song or a bit of comedy or a bit of poetry, in my case. And then at the same time, someone spins a wheel and the wheel announces an impediment that will hinder their act, which are performed by clowns. So it might be, one of them was the weather, and there's someone dressed as the weather, pouring water on you, being the rain, making thunder noises. One of them was Terry Wogan, and there was a comedian just as Terry Wogan doing Eurovision style commentary over the top of whatever you're doing. There was a Victorian ghost, and so by the time I got on midway through the show, I was being attacked by all these clowns at once while reading some poems. But I didn't end up reading this poem. This is one of the older poems in the book. I think it falls into the middle weird section. But also I think, like some of the others, it's interested in the idea of what a poem can do. The idea of a poem having a practical effect in the world. But it's just in this case, that effect is horrible. It's also about empathy and how empathy can be a horrible thing. But it's quite silly. Curse. Oh, and great, you've got it on the page. Fantastic. Curse. Greg gently mashing the keys of a Steinway. Or Greg, brow furrowed, struggling to grasp a toothbrush, album, cup. Now Greg in bed, listen for the unconsolable clop that comes each night before his hopeless prayers. unhappy Greg, remembering the touch of things, of people, of his mother's face. Has he not suffered? Has he not served his time? Then we shall help him. Slowly lift your arms into this poem, into Greg's small room, into his sleeping body. Take his hooves and wear them. Look, it's not so bad. Try to come to terms with them, the hooves, the uncompromising fact of them, unfeeling as woodwork, 4 uncrackable lumps of keratin, hard, staccato, blunt. I wore them for an hour, Greg for 3 whole stanzas. Reader, you will keep them until the day when, thumbless, you remaster the knack of how to turn a page.
I'm muted. Sorry. Thank you so much for reading that. Thank you. That was beautiful. There was this one last really lovely question from Paula Armley in the Q&A, which I think we could spend an hour talking about, but I don't think we have time. From Paula, I find myself wondering about the poet as a sort of super emotionally intelligent crossword setter. Is this near the feeling of it or very far away? I want that on a little 3x5 note card above my desk. I think the idea of the super emotionally intelligent crossword setter. Is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, I love that idea. I absolutely love that idea. I want to be the last person to call myself super emotionally intelligent. I think I'm emotionally very stupid. And I think a lot of my poetry is about butting my head against that fact.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we're just past 8, and that's kind of that. We get to time. I will disappear. Thank you so much for just such a gorgeous reading, Tristram. It was really good to see you, and I hope to catch up in person soon. I will pass over to Jasmine.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much, and congratulations, Tristram. This was such a great reading. I'm so pleased you squeezed that extra poem in at the end. Thank you guys for being here and for all your excellent comments in the chat box and for your questions. The link is in the chat for you. Go and buy a copy. Please redeem your discount code. Buy one for everyone you know. Write reviews and send them to us. That would be great. The last thing for me to say is please join us again next time. We will be here this time next week. We're launching a new and selected edition by John Birtwistle. That's in the chat. There's a link to our website. Sign up for our newsletter so you never miss any of our excellent Zoom events. So I'll leave the chat open for a couple of minutes. You can say goodbyes and thank yous. But yeah, thank you guys, and well done, Tristram. It was great.